Welcome to this Melbourne Writers Festival 2020 event. My name is Sally Warhaft. It is such a thrill to be here to interview and have a conversation today with our guest. Of course, this was not the way we were all expecting to meet this year. And we're thrilled, though, to be able to bring this online digital Melbourne Writers Festival event to you today. And it's brought to you with the support of the wonderful Wheeler Centre in Melbourne and Melbourne Writers Festival. And I would like to express our thanks. And our guest today is Paul Adler. And Paul is the Harold Quinton Chair in Business Policy at the University of Southern California. He grew up in Australia, even though he's been in the States since 1981. And he works on the management of complex organisations and the interactions between business, government and society. And his book, which I will flash before you, is called The 99% Economy, How Democratic Socialism Can Overcome the Crises of Capitalism. And just to let you know that you can get this book through the Melbourne Writers Festival website, which you should visit anyway, or through the Readings Bookshop and Readings, the official bookseller for the Writers Festival this year. Welcome, Paul. It's wonderful to see you.
It's a treat to be with you. Really delighted to be here.
And look, we're talking to you, of course, you're in the States, in Los Angeles. So perhaps let's start by you setting the scene of what's going on in California, in America, because your book is largely focused on the United States. So tell us about life there at the moment.
Oh my. Well, we are dealing badly with the COVID crisis that everyone else is struggling with too. So it's a little crazy. There's a kind of underlying dread and anxiety. There's anger at the incompetence of our national administration, some modest degree of confidence in the local authorities that at the state and city level, people seem to be pretty conscious of what needs to be done. But, you know, to go to the heart of the matter today, in a capitalist society where people have to go to work to make a living, it's putting a lot of people under enormous strain, it being torn between the need to bring some money back home and protect themselves and their families from this pandemic.
You wrote your book, of course, it was published before the coronavirus, but tell us what, your impressions of how capitalism has responded to this pandemic, to this global crisis.
Yeah, right. Yes, obviously, having written this book, I have a peculiar point of view on the COVID situation and have been sort of checking the ideas of the book against the reality of the COVID mess as it unfolds here. I suppose the fair thing to say is that different countries seem to have responded better or worse, and we in the US seem to be on the worse end of that scale. The incompetence of this administration sort of beggars belief. But it's not just this particular administration. I think it's also true that, as in Australia and many other countries around the world, we also live with the legacy of many years of neoliberal policy that have stripped a lot of the public sector of its capacity to respond to an emergency like this. And that, as a socialist, I look at this and I say, even if, though that more social democratic kind of welfare system had been up and running, our ability to respond to this crisis would be handicapped as long as we stuck within the framework of your basic capitalist economy. It's gotten me thinking, one of the ideas I advanced in the book is that if you wanted some image of what socialism might look like on a national scale, you might look at the way Australia or the United States responded during World War II to the economic mobilization. That there you saw government step up, take control of industry, assure essential sort of health and well-being for the population, the ones that were not sent off to fight, assure some equitable access to the necessities of everyday life. coordinate all the multiple aspects of the economy, and even for that matter, in this case, you'd like a society that could mobilize its R&D capacities, coordinate them somehow. And so I think if you scratch the surface, you also see that our societies have been, whether it's Australia or the US or Germany or Sweden, all of these societies have been handicapped in their ability to deal with this pandemic in the way that you imagine we should be able to, by virtue of the capitalistic character of the underlying economy that we're living with.
They have all flipped pretty quickly, though, haven't they, to supporting people, particularly those economies you mentioned, not so much the United States, and we can get back to that. But certainly in Australia, we've seen a conservative coalition government almost overnight forget its beliefs and credentials for neoliberalism, and in fact behave more like a democratic socialist government in its handouts, in cooperation within Australia. I think we've seen far less of that between nation states. So on the one hand, we've seen capitalism completely unable to shut down for 6 weeks throughout the world without causing an economic catastrophe, but on the other hand, be flexible enough in advanced Western economies to be able to provide at this stage, of course we don't know what's to come, the basic income protection, health protection. Certainly in Australia, there has been that flexibility there. Has that surprised you?
No, the incompetence of the American administration has surprised me, but that even a capitalist and, for that matter, neoliberal government like you might have in Australia, that they can recognize the urgency of this moment and move to a quasi-war footing, right? This we've seen capitalist economies do in the past. I was referring to World War II as an example of something a little similar. I think the challenge here is that these measures that we've seen in the more advanced economies, the more advanced than America economies, these measures are by nature extremely expensive in a capitalist economy and unsustainable over the longer term. I think there's been willingness to engage them because people have been operating on the assumption that this COVID pandemic will be over soon enough. And so, okay, let's write a few checks to all our workers, keep everybody kind of afloat temporarily. But the pressures because we're living in a capitalist economy, the pressures to get the economy up and running again in that traditional way are mounting every day. And so that I think it's very hard to see how we stay on this war-like footing in countries like Australia or Germany as this pandemic keeps on making its way through the population.
There's a quote in the book that it's from Frederick Jameson. It has become easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. I'm wondering if you can speak to that quote a little bit. It feels particularly true in this moment, but to introduce this idea of imagining, being able to imagine societies governing themselves in a completely different way, which is what you propose.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I do want to maybe say one more thing about COVID, perhaps. You'll notice I identified half a dozen big intractable problems that I thought capitalism as a system confronted. Health pandemics was not one of them. Because I do think we can easily enough imagine capitalism solving all kinds of problems, including, for that matter, a response on a temporary basis to an emergency, like a world war, like a pandemic. So I was pretty careful in selecting the kinds of problems that I thought made the best argument for socialism. And they were, we can talk about them, we can go back over them. But let's go back to your question. That's really the main motivation behind the book. Yeah, my sense is that we've seen an upsurge of interest in alternative forms of society, an upsurge of sort of anger and frustration at the capitalistic forms of society we've lived under. There's a considerable amount of debate and confusion on the left as to what kind of society we should be fighting for, as between those who would look towards a more Scandinavian social democratic kind of compromise, if you will, between capitalism and socialism, and those who still hold out hope for some more radical restructuring of the economy itself, along socialist lines. That second branch of the alternative, that more rigorous socialistic sort of vision of the future, has almost disappeared from view in public debate. So we hear a lot of talk about cooperatives, about corporate social responsibility, about social enterprise, about community provisioning, but very little about I think, the core of the socialist vision, which was to put the fundamental economic structure under democratic control, to expand the scope of democracy from the political realm to encompass the very complex economic realm, to have enough courage to imagine that democracy could be robust enough to enable us to manage together our future. And so I wanted to put some flesh to that image that has been almost evacuated from polite conversation over the last couple of decades. That was the goal, yes, to imagine what socialism might look like. I took my way of approaching that it will be quite strange to readers, but maybe we can talk about that in a minute too. But yes, that was the goal. I felt like socialism in the strong version that I wanted to defend had disappeared from public discourse, and that I needed to find some way to make it real enough in people's imagination to be able to discuss its pros and cons, how we might get there if we thought it was a good idea, and why we might not want to go there if you thought it was a bad idea.
You use the example of Aristotle in the book of that, how difficult it is to imagine. Is it harder for you to imagine the sort of utopia in a way that you describe in the book? Is it harder to imagine what that looks like, or to imagine how it would happen? I mean, it is you read the book and the response is, well, some of these ideas may sound well and good or wonderful, but how on earth can you imagine them being put into place?
Yeah, let's start with the Aristotle issue. I did indeed come around to thinking that we suffered a bit the same kind of problem that Aristotle did in his day. They tell me he was a very smart man back in ancient Greece, very progressive too, but for the life of him, he couldn't imagine political democracy being, yes, amongst male property owners, by all means, that was a system that he celebrated, but the idea of expanding the political participation rights to women or slaves was just beyond his comprehension. He assumed that if we did such a thing, democracy would descend into rule by the rabble. And here's this unusually smart guy, very thoughtful fellow, and you see he was incapable of imagining a form of society which today we take for granted. And so it was a bit, I think we living in a capitalist world, we suffer a similar difficulty as Aristotle did in trying to imagine a world that would be so radically different from our own. You ask, is it more difficult to imagine what that world might be than to imagine how we get from here to there? I left how we get from here to there to the very last part of the book because I do have an answer to this question, but it's not a very satisfying one. I think my first task was to try to imagine what the there would look like. If we don't have any sense of where it is we'd like to get to, how radically different it is from the current system, how it might work, then it's very hard to put our minds to the task of how we get from here to there. We can, if you don't know where you go, if you don't know where you want to get to, any path will lead you there. So I'd rather have some approximate sense of where we want to go, and then let's improvise and discuss and debate different pathways for getting there. The pathways for getting there that I see, and I said were not very satisfactory, because as best I can tell, they all pass through crisis. We are going to confront very shortly an environmental crisis that risks civilization as we know it. In the face of that crisis, people are slowly waking up, and a summer with 3 or 4 massive storms that swamp 3 or 4 big American cities, all of a sudden American public opinion is going to swing around as tens of millions of people get in their cars to flee Florida. You can easily imagine political will to have federal government step up and engage a planning process that could enable us to deal with the climate crisis, you could imagine a quite dramatic turnaround in a short period of time, a little similar to the turnaround we've seen in governments like Australia in response to the COVID crisis, but now on a much larger scale for much deeper transformation. So that environmental crisis, I think, is looming and offers catastrophic prospects for humanity, but also very optimistic prospects for social transformation. I think economic crisis is also around the corner, where the economic problems that many of our countries are having, we're blaming on COVID, but in reality, if you scratch the surface, you see that the corporate sector across all our countries is so severely out of proportion. The level of indebtedness in the corporate sector has reached the same kind of stratospheric levels at just before the 2008 global financial crisis. So the COVID crisis in a way was a little knock that pulled down this whole castle of cards. The capitalist economy has been running on Federal Reserve, central bank injections of massive amounts of funds for over nearly 2 decades now. So I think the economic crisis will open up new prospects for change too. And then I would say, in the US context, I would say, were we to elect a real social democratic president and they had control of Congress, even a Biden, but let alone a Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, who are now out of the race, their efforts to implement the kinds of changes they want to make will encounter such massive resistance from the business sector that that'll create a political crisis. And in the face of that political crisis, as in many other social democratic countries, as they've tried to implement social democratic reform, the resistance of the business sector often generates a political crisis where we either roll back those social democratic reforms or we move forward to more deeply socialistic transformation. So I'm optimistic for the future, but unfortunately it passes through these very dark crisis moments as best I can see it. I'm not sure how else we get from here to there.
Let's talk a bit more about Bernie Sanders, because there was an opportunity there for, I suppose, a mild version of what you're proposing, but Sanders certainly talked about it being a movement and that it was a movement of the young. But ultimately, of course, the young just didn't come out, did they? They didn't put their hands up. What did that tell you, and how disappointing was it for you?
Well, it was very disappointing. It was hard not to be enthralled by the kind of energy that Sanders engendered in so many people. I went to a couple of his rallies, and it was pretty amazing to see people of every age group, not just young, people of every ethnic, racial group, really excited about this sort of expansive vision that he offered. As you said quite correctly, it's essentially a social democratic vision, not that different from what the ALP might have been proposing 30 years ago. But it was a very exciting vision for a lot of people. Why didn't they step up and put their hands up when it came time to vote? I think there's a real deficiency in political organization. Somehow we have to find a way to reinvent forms of real political engagement. The old mass social democratic parties of the 20th century have disappeared. They've disappeared, I think, not only because their policies were bankrupt, they ended up buying into the neoliberal kind of regime and lost their credibility, but also because that form of organization doesn't seem to fit with our 21st century sensibilities. And I don't know what the answer is, but I'm pretty confident that we're not going to get very far at all unless we find a way to really get people organized together. It's not a question of just voting in an election every now and again. You need some mechanism to engage citizens in policy making, to engage them in, and the traditional way of doing it was through a party structure where you had local groups that voted on ideas and their ideas sort of ended up shaping the direction of the overall party. You had some top-down leadership, some bottom-up input. But that model, that organizational form, has lost its pertinence, and we're going to have to find some new ones. And I fear that that's going to be a longer task, that maybe there's another 10 or 20 years of work we need to do to put into place that kind of organizational infrastructure that would be required to really make the radical transformations we need to.
I mean, if you can't get people to vote for a candidate that, you know, that they were saying was incredibly appealing to them, it's hard to imagine how you motivate people to actually become part of a structure, part of an organisation in any more formal way at all. What about democracy itself, Paul? Because you're very, very clear, of course, that your version of democratic socialism depends on democracy, but there's a sense that, of course, in some places that democracy itself is in crises. There are many people that are looking at the United States at the moment and saying it is a failed state. So if you're wanting to promote a movement that depends so much more on government even than now, and trust in government, what is the relationship between that and the actual current state of democracy?
Yes. Well, the current state of democracy is so depressing, I think, because we've been in a period now since the 1970s, 1980s, where the whole machinery of capitalist economic growth has been clutching. If you look at the data on rates of economic growth, rates of productivity increase and so forth, it's quite striking how the whole Western advanced economic world has been slowing down. There's been little spurts of growth, but overall, the whole system is clutching. The rate of profit in the corporate sector is very wobbly. Levels of indebtedness go up as a substitute for profits. I think I refer to the economic conditions because I think what has been going on is that for lack of courage to advance a more socialistic program, what we were saying a second ago, the social democratic parties, the labor parties of the world have retreated essentially to something much closer to neoliberalism, the third way of Blair, and the similar tendencies in the American Democratic Party, the Australian Labor Party. These tendencies leave working people without any hope that these parties can represent their future. And that's what we saw when Clinton was the candidate for the Democratic Party here in 2016. There was no reason, if you're a working person in America, to believe that Hillary Clinton was going to be the president that changes your life as a working person. She was a corporate Democrat through and through, and she believed in the power of capitalism to yield benefits for working people, except it hasn't been able to. And so it's not a very plausible position. As a result, we have two conservative parties, one called Republican, the other called Democratic. Why would working people invest their faith in any of them? And if they don't, now you've got a political system where the dominant parties lack legitimacy in the eyes of so many people. And I think to me, that's where we're seeing the roots of this populist, xenophobic kind of rhetoric. If government can't actually meet people's needs, it maybe can meet their imaginary needs to blame the other for their problems. So I think the failures of democracy, the progressive weakening of democracy is a reflection of the lack of political will to overcome this capitalist crisis. So am I optimistic that if we were able to articulate a more progressive vision of what's required than Hillary Clinton was able to, and that we were able to organize people and give them a chance to shape that program the way the Sanders campaign didn't, but it promised to, I'm optimistic that we can renew democracy as a powerful force of change.
Your vision depends on a lot more government, more layers, more input. And yet you've just described, of course, a whole set of failings that are, they're as much about human beings as they are about the systems of governance. And, if I reflect on the biggest problems of humanity, whether it's hunger, poverty, inequality, racism, sexism, environmental catastrophe. It seems to have been a long time, if ever, that under any system of government anywhere, that even a single huge problem has been solved. anywhere. And so I wonder, the human element that feels sometimes like it's missing from ideas of placing one system of governance on another.
Is your concern the willingness of our fellow citizens to invest themselves in political life, or is it your
motivation and participation is certainly a big issue, but I suppose more at the core of what I'm wanting to hear about is that whatever the system of government is, it's probably going to be the same people that are attracted to participate in it. So there's that. And therefore all their flaws and strengths will be evident no matter what it is. But also, I mean, I'm an anthropologist and, the human beings that fascinate me. I'm not at all sure, after 30 years of thinking about this, whether human beings just aren't quite selfish creatures. No matter what system we're in. Obviously there's enormous capacity for empathy and for community and so on, and we need that. And in fact, the coronavirus shows us so much how we need each other. But it also shows us incredible selfishness and individualistic tendencies of human beings. And when people have theories or talk about visions of governance, how does the nature of human beings fit into that?
Yeah. So you might call me naive in my optimism, but
it's not. It's delightful, your optimism. It's just something for me to spend the rest of my life wishing and hoping for.
Maybe it's in the water in California or something, but. So here's a story. I got a chance to study an automobile assembly plant that used to be run by General Motors, and they had to shut it down because it was the worst performing plant in the whole system. The quality level was atrocious. The workforce average absenteeism on any given day was something like 25% of their workers never showed up. They couldn't usually start the assembly line on a Monday morning because there were too few people there. They shut it down. Toyota was eager, this is back in the 1980s, Toyota was eager to set up factories in the United States to deal with the trade tensions. So they looked around for a partner to do it with. They were very cautious. This was their first overseas implantation of a real assembly plant. And they ended up teaming up with General Motors and taking over this plant. They took over the same workforce because it was a unionized workforce, and having shut down the plant, under the union contract, General Motors would have been declaring war on the union had they tried to reopen the plant with Toyota absent the union. The same union leaders came back, the same union workforce came back. Now, you need to know something about this workforce. I said absenteeism. We could talk about any kind of drugs you wanted, any time of the day were available in the parking lot, if not in the bathrooms of the plant itself. There were, on average, something like 3,000 grievances in play at any given point in time in the contentious relations between labor and management. You had workers, I talked to a lot of workers in this plant, and their main goal in life was to work as little as possible. It was a well-paying job. They didn't want to lose the job, but the whole point was, let's sabotage production. Oh, yeah, I should have said, you also had a lot of student radicals from Berkeley that was just down the road who took jobs there deliberately to foster revolutionary consciousness in the working class. So you can imagine this plant was not exactly a General Motors style plant. Toyota took over this plant, rehired all these same workers under obligation, and offered them respect, offered them a chance to help design a work process that would ensure high quality, low cost cars were coming off the assembly line at the end of the plant. They listened to their suggestions. They organized them into teams, gave them training. in what the production system looked like, how to formulate suggestions so that they could test for themselves whether they were working from an engineering and an economic point of view. And this same workforce turned around. Within 2 years, they were the highest quality, second in productivity only to Takaoka's plant in Japan, which was the highest productivity plant in the world, producing small cars. And this wasn't just a momentary, enthusiasm on the part of a workforce grateful to have their jobs back. That's certainly a factor, but then you would have expected the enthusiasm to wear out over time. Instead, this same plant continued delivering this amazing level of quality and productivity for the next 20, 30 years. Eventually it was shut down because market conditions after 2008 meant that Toyota had overcapacity. But the workers there, was fascinating talking to them. One of them said to me, I'm sort of quoting from memory now, he had been on the assembly line and doing the same job for 12 years, installing, I think it was the rear tire of the vehicle. Huge guy, you can imagine lifting a tire every 60 seconds to put on this vehicle. And Toyota opened up new opportunities for him. He said to me at one point, I used to be a horse's ass. I would come home from work at the end of the day, put my feet up on the kitchen table and yell to the wife to get me a beer. And now I work in a team every day and I come home and I say, oh, what can I do to help? It's kind of natural that if I'm, working in a team and we're working together to try to make a better car, higher quality, lower cost car, that changes my attitude to my life. Now, I'm sure he was leading me on a little bit, glorifying his spiritual renaissance. But I found this to be very true. In organizations, when people have a purpose, have a shared purpose, then they can summon up from within themselves a commitment to that purpose that changes their personality, changes their life. And can we do that? We can certainly do that in organizations. We've seen that in organizations. The effect in capitalist organizations is typically pretty temporary because there's always going to be the next wave of layoffs and markets buffet this and some new manager comes in with their own stupid ideas that destroy that fabric of trust and collaboration. So it's always a bit precarious, any of these kind of purpose-driven organizations in the capitalist sector. But it showed me that it was at least possible, even in a very large organization, and even starting with people who began with the most cynical, most adversarial point of view. You could turn people around and make them real eager participants in this collectivity. Could we do the same thing on a national level? I don't see why not. There's enormous amount of goodwill. Think about the masses of young people who've gotten involved in the anti-racist struggle in the wake of Black Lives Matter, or the environmental struggle with Greta Thunberg and all the rest of it. There's an enormous amount of hunger to put meaning into our lives. And if we had a political system that gave people a shared sense of national purpose, or global purpose for that matter, we're fighting this pandemic on a global scale, I do think it doesn't mean that bigotry disappears overnight. It doesn't mean that selfishness disappears overnight, but the dominant tenor, the dominant tone of everyday interaction changes when people work on the assumption that we're all here to contribute somehow. As for leaders, maybe make one observation. A lot of people are concerned about the idea that when government has this much power in an economy, you would surely imagine power-hungry people gravitating to it. I would say that I think we know a lot now about accountability in government systems. And once you make it very clear that these leaders are going to be accountable to their electors for their performance, and that they're not going to be able to shield themselves from that accountability, all of a sudden a lot of those power-seeking people go elsewhere because they want power. They definitely don't want to be accountable for the way they use their power. So I think a system of democracy with considerably enhanced mechanisms of accountability that hold political leaders accountable for how effectively they are leading us around our shared purposes, I think that would unleash an enormous amount of goodwill amongst our fellow citizens. Call me optimistic.
I do call you optimistic, but we need that. There's not a lot of it about at the moment. So your book title, The 99% Economy, refers to the idea that the system at the moment serves only 1%, and that 99% are left out of the real benefits or of what you envisage those could be. If I can put a dampener on your optimism for a moment and say, well, we're not going to have democratic socialism in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years in the way you hope it could be or see that it could be. What are the parts? What are the main bits of what you envisage that you would like to see? Also, assuming that any change doesn't just happen overnight, what are the bits that you think would benefit the most people in the most powerful way?
Yeah.
Or does it depend on it being a whole?
No, that wouldn't be a helpful answer on my part. There are certainly policies that we should be fighting for that would become in turn platforms for further advances. I think whatever we can do to strengthen working class voices in the political system, it would be an important a step forward. So in the United States, we have unusual problems of this kind because of the deep corruption, the sort of money and politics problem that we have here. So I do think that would be an important source of reform that could help move things forward. I think decommodifying critical public services, sort of reasserting the power of nationalized public services that decommodify the provisioning of critical social goods. Obviously, Australia already has a lot more of that infrastructure than we do here in the United States. But in the United States, we need a public health option. We need people to have guaranteed access to healthcare when they need it. Socializing the access to healthcare would be an enormous win. We've got childcare. I don't quite know the situation in Australia, but the lack of publicly
very expensive is the situation.
And somehow we need to socialize the provision of childcare because this is an enormous constraint on working people's capacity to engage life, and women above all, obviously, are still responsible for the main part for childcare, and socializing the provision of childcare could be an enormous win and free up women to engage more in both the wage labor force and beyond that in the civic life of the community.
Well, demonstrated so intensely at the moment too, isn't it, both in Australia and the United States, where it's women, surprise, surprise, who have taken on the burden of looking after children in the home. And, of course, it's their incomes, the roll-on effects of that are immense. Mm.
A lot of people put stock, a lot of people in sort of my camp put a lot of stock in the idea of putting workers on the boards of the corporations they work for, the businesses they work for. I put less emphasis on that argument because while I think empowering workers in their work activities, like I just described Toyota did in this auto plant, I think is a huge win for working people. It gives them a chance to develop capacities that change their lives and give them resources with which they can engage civic activities too. I don't know that putting their representatives on the boards is going to change very much. Once you're on the board of one of these big corporations, you have to deal with the same burdens of competitiveness and profitability as all the other corporate, finance types on the board sitting with you. And they're, as long as we're in a capitalist system, in which firms have to compete for financial inputs and have to compete with each other on product markets and have to compete with other firms on the labor market, then even if these enterprises were constructed as worker cooperatives, they'd be stuck with all those same dilemmas. So I'm less impressed by plans to put workers on the boards, but I am impressed by any effort we can succeed at socializing the provision, whether it's the energy sector or the education sector, or the childcare sector, or the healthcare sector. I think once we can, and if we can, I do think while there are limits to this, there's a lot we can do to improve the quality of government services. People lose faith in government services when those government services are starved of resources, when they're outsourced to private sector contractors, when they can't get the services that they need from those government agencies. And I think a progressive social democratic government that decided to make public service work would do an enormous amount to restore the credibility of nationalized public sector, socialization of ownership. And I think I would put some weight on those demands, the demands to give us the high quality healthcare, education, childcare, energy infrastructure, so forth. I think just making government work effectively could be a big win in restoring people's confidence that government can do stuff.
Paul, our time's almost up, so I'll ask one more question, and that is, you've written this radical book as an academic in a business school, and I'm wondering how that, I know you're in California, and perhaps that's a bit more accommodating of such an approach, but how do your ideas go down in that setting in California, in the States? So you sort of looked as some sort of lunatic Australian, or how do other your colleagues take in these ideas?
Yeah, so I'm thinking of a few different audiences. My students love it. A lot of the ideas in this book have come out of my teaching of undergraduate business majors and MBA students at the graduate. Some of them come into class with a dream of becoming a big capitalist mogul, right? Even those, however, don't leave their citizenship behind. They understand that society is grappling with these questions, and they'd like a way to think about it. But many of them, especially at the MBA level, understand full well that they're headed to middling positions in the corporate hierarchy, where they'll be dealing with all of these tensions, all of these problems that I discuss in my book that make capitalism such a unsatisfying system. This is the everyday stuff of a manager's life. You have to interact with the local city council to get building permits, but you know that city council's in the control of commercial real estate interests. You've got to hire people into your company, but you know that down the pike you're going to have to fire some of them because business is likely to turn down next year. As a manager, you're constantly dealing with these same contradictions, and giving our students a way to think about those contradictions, I think that speaks to a need that they have. So amongst my students, I think there's real enthusiasm to embrace, to engage these ideas, whether they agree or disagree. When I'm teaching, I don't preach. This book does not appear on my syllabus. They don't know at the end of the semester whether I'm with Karl Marx or Milton Friedman. And I'm very proud of that fact, because I want to inculcate critical thinking on their part. I don't need to be using my podium as a teacher to preach. But then I have colleagues in the business school, and obviously some of them are ideologically pretty to the right, and so they just think I'm a mad Australian, as you said. But many others are not. Many of them are professors, middle-class people who understand these same conflicts, and they struggle to make sense of them too. And so I've had a lot of support from most of my colleagues for articulating these ideas. At least it gives them some concrete image of what this socialism thing might look like on the best of days. And so now we can have an argument. So I'm on lots of conference panel discussions, defending my ideas and engaging dialogue with people who come from very different places along the political spectrum. But there's a hunger. People sense that capitalism is failing. It's not, and part of it is they say, well, maybe it's just neoliberalism that's failing, but it's not like social democracy is doing much better for anybody. Economic inequality in Sweden is way higher, even in the United States. Their ability to tackle the environmental crisis is no greater than anybody else's. So yes, they've got some nice welfare provisions that make people feel better in their everyday life, but obviously it's not a solution that really sings to people. So I've been very gratified by the positive response to the ideas I've laid out.
Well, you certainly do lay them out. Here we are again. That's the book, The 99% Economy. We've, of course, today just touched on, what you go into in the book about what you imagine. And I'll remind people tuning in again that you can get this book through the Melbourne Writers Festival website or through Readings, the official bookseller, The 99% Economy. Paul, I really hope that capitalism, as we see it right now, doesn't represent, humanity's highest achievement in how we're to organise ourselves. Whether or not, as time comes to pass, the vision you have will come, or something else, who knows. But what is really unquestionably wonderful is that there are people like you imagining something different, and something that represents perhaps benefits to a great deal more of humanity than we see at the moment. And it is a particularly interesting time to have read this book. And one thing I did feel sure about is that if anything is to change, it's probably crises like the one we're living through at the moment that will give change a boost. But then, of course, you have to wonder and hope that that change is for the better. That's the troubling thing, isn't it? At the moment, evidence is there that change could tug in a way that's really, really frightening. But optimists like you, I'm going to go with you. I'm going to be hopeful, and I also hope that we do get a chance to meet one day. I was so looking forward to sitting on a stage with you. We have this wonderful virtual stage, though, instead. Thank you again to the Melbourne Writers Festival for making this happen. And another reminder, there are, I think, going to be more than 40 online events. So please enjoy. Everybody enjoy. Have a wonderful festival. Paul, have a great day, a great evening, great afternoon. We're all in different time zones. And thank you again so much for being a part of it. And take care over there, and see you, when the skies open up. Paul Adler, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you so much.